That's a great way to start. I mean, we'll talk more about the least restrictive part in a minute, but we're going to try something a little different to start us off. And Asan Davis from HD Solutions is going to give us a piece of art first to kind of set the tone for what we're going to talk about.
The bat fell fast and hard against my back and my head. My vision blurred and focused, blurred and focused, blurred and focused on the object of my pain and my fears. I wake trembling, lying in a pool of my own sweat on the television. The source of my pain brought to me in living color. See, somewhere a black man is being beaten or shot or stabbed or tased to death and nobody seems to give a damn. Somewhere a white man lies bloody and battered and beaten in some obscene justice. These are the images introducing us to a new world order. 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, our great ideas may not survive this storm. Somewhere, stereotypes have been passed to a child who's never seen me before. A belief in the natural ignorance of color. A belief that justice is and should be based on the shades of one's darkness. And somewhere, a child like me, who grew up tired and hungry on these American streets, has had his greatest fear come to life. The fear that his pain matters less than any others. The fear that his struggle for equality guarantees him no respect. Somewhere our children, black and white, indigenous and immigrant, have been led to ruin because justice has turned her blind eye on their tears. With these thoughts to torment me, I drift painfully back to sleep. But in this dream, there is a weapon in my hands. And in this dream, there is a white man chained and thrown at my feet. And in this dream, he starts to curse me, goading me into what he knows must be my next natural act. But he looks surprised as I raise that weapon high above my head and bring it down and again down across these chains that have held us ignorant for so long. And then I extend my hand. So now as we start our journey toward understanding, he will learn that he can rest his tired weight on strong black shoulders. And now as we start our trek toward the truth, I will learn that I can trust blue eyes to watch my back. And now as we start our pilgrimage toward unity, we will learn that justice is still alive, that just us few people have the power to restore this beauty's righteous sight. See, these are my visions for all of you, my people. Visions.
Okay, I'm just going to admit that our panel discussion probably won't be that good. But just from the start, but that was great. That was great. We're going to try to rise to that level. I'm Brent Patterson. I'm joined today by 3 fantastic panelists, Mr. Davis, who you've already heard from. Also, Trainee Stovall, who's the director of the DeKalb County Child Advocacy Center and a member of the Children's Rights Litigation Committee, and Jennifer Rodriguez from the Youth Law Center. What we're going to try to talk about today is what if kids were placed in the least restrictive setting. And as Angela said very intelligently at the beginning, we've got some pretty good law on that, right? Like, this is a place where almost every system that we work against or with or in makes a guarantee statutorily or through case law that kids will be given the sort of least restrictive environment, whether it's school, whether it's mental health, child welfare, juvenile justice. And yet, we know that residential placements, congregate care facilities are overused in spite of the harms they can cause, both in terms of duration of stay and number of kids who are in them, that we make decisions about placing kids out of fear, like Mr. Bell talked about today. And there's no question that after our lunch discussion, I mean, that race plays a huge factor in what we do in these, and that the kids of color we represent, they are disproportionately impacted by our policies and practices around placement. So we hope this discussion today will be a way to think creatively and strategically to radically reimagine where we go from here. with addressing these problems. And, you know, maybe families first solves everything, right? But people are probably suspicious about that, as they should be. So the way we're going to do this first is we're going to start with a different kind of artistic exercise, following up on Mr. Davis's words. We want you guys to use your devices. Let's see if I can make this work. I think we're good. Yeah. So what values would form the basis for a better system than we have? If we were going to radically reimagine the sort of way we place kids in congregate care and the way we serve kids in general, what values would form the basis for that better system? And as you folks are creating the word cloud, I want to start posing a similar question to our panelists, and that is, what would it look like? What would we be doing differently? And if it's okay, I'll start with you, Trainee. Put you on the spot first.
What would it look like? So I run an agency of attorneys who represent children in foster care. And we represent about 1,500 children every year. About a fourth of our clients are youth, and so they're moving around a lot, and quite frankly, the majority of them live in multiple group homes or congregate care, detention centers or jails or therapeutic placements where they are restricted. And when I was originally asked to do this panel, I thought, what exactly does least restrictive, what's that supposed to mean? What does least restrictive mean? And then you asked this question just now, and my thought about that, what values? The values of my daughter. What would be relevant for my daughter? What's good enough for her? Those are those values. What's really good enough for her? That's the standard by which I would define what a least restrictive placement looks like. We kind of presuppose that question presumes that a foster home might itself be less restrictive. And sometimes I would beg that question, I would reject that premise as well. Because a foster home or anywhere in a system that is not with that child's family or where that child cannot call that home is a restrictive placement. What might it look like? What would those values look like? It would look like a system that said our resources go in before this child ever becomes defined as system connected. Our resources go in to the cross systems that engage each other so that when the hospital or the school or the neighbor down the street or the service provider, when any of those entities identify a child at risk, those entities come together before that child becomes system engaged. Those are the values that matter to me because that's what I would expect for someone who saw there to be an issue with my child. And so I guess I would start there and not wanting to take too much time because I have a long list of what we all know looks like. It looks like early intervention. It looks like diverting out of the system. It looks like what reasonable efforts really are. Reasonable efforts to really avoid a child coming in court. Reasonable diligent search to really identify families. Children and youth actually in the conversation, at the beginning of the conversation, because they know who their aunt or their granny or their auntie that's not really their auntie is that can help keep them out of a system. Those are the things that we all know are the things that could work if they actually work that we theorize, because in my world, it never actually really happens. And it also looks like something that lawyers, and with all due respect to the bench here, it looks like courts who are accountable and who hold the parties that engage, that come before those courts accountable. There are laws in place, but for those laws to work, that means that the courts have to do their job as well and hold us all accountable to our roles and uphold those laws. So that's kind of what my value system looks like.
Jennifer, what do you think it looks like? What would a better system look like compared to the one we're living in now?
So if I had to answer this question, I would have used the value of justice. And I think to me, justice really can't be separated from love for children who are in care. And, you know, I often explain to people that how I ended up there it really has changed over time. And when I was growing up in the system, in group homes and in juvenile hall and shelter in the streets, I would say that my definition of justice was being free from adults. At all times, I wanted to be free. I was a runner. And a cutter and a fighter, and the one they had to keep pulling off the street. And, you know, really, adults were never able to be trustworthy, not with my body, not with my spirit, not with my life generally. After I left care, and I left care really in the exact same situation I entered care in, I left care back to the streets. I started doing advocacy work, and here in California, spent about a decade really building our youth advocacy and organizing group to empower other young people who had been in the system. And my definition of justice then, if you had asked me, was the right to be heard. The right to be seen and heard and have a seat at the table and have people listen to our opinions and have the policy discussions reflect what we thought were the priorities, to be part of the solutions. And then I went to law school because I came a little bit intoxicated with the idea that I could be on the other side of the power that had run my entire childhood. And in law school, I learned that what justice was it was procedural, right? It was getting notice and showing up and being heard and due process. And none of those ultimately really felt like justice to me. But I couldn't quite put my finger on what it actually was until I had my own baby. And trying to explain to people the meaning of somebody who looks at you and sees that the whole world is possible, and who sees you never as the worst things you did on the worst days of your life, but who literally sees you for all of the history that went into that child standing there and all of the future that can become of them. That's justice. And to me, it's literally the only magic that we have in foster care or juvenile justice, is that love and that parenting and that nurturing. I mean, it is literally magic. There's a little group of us who flew late last night from DC from a convening on dual status youth, and I had the honor of moderating a panel of young people there, and in asking what protected them from becoming incarcerated, without fail, the answer was my auntie, my mother, knowing that she would show up at court hearings. It was the love and the relationship. So that to me is the value. And obviously, when I think about the term least restrictive environment, I actually think it's a really misleading term, because I think it implies that what the biggest deprivation is for young people is a physical restriction or a loss of physical freedom. And in fact, if I were to rename it, I would be looking at placing young people in the most connected environment. Because I think about what Liz said earlier on the panel, and she was telling us all the things you could fix, right? You could fix that floor, you could add the horsey doggy door there. Well, I know from my own life and from getting to work with really thousands of youth, over the last 17 years, I know what you can't fix. And what you can't fix is you can't fix broken hearts, and you can't fix people feeling like they're less than human, and you can't fix loneliness. You can't heal those things, and those things literally destroy our young people. No amount of effective legal counsel or great lawyering or low caseloads or fancy interventions or wonderful services, no amount of those things can take those away. Where the magic in our system is, it's in parenting. And I just don't think we don't think about that. You know, if we had a system that actually focused on the most connected environment, then we would view every single moment that young people are not being parented, when they're behind bars, when they're in prisons, and prisons come with bars and they come without bars. Probably every single one of you has, in your jurisdiction, has a shelter or a group home that you walk into that is not a secure facility, but those young people are incarcerated. They are incarcerated by loneliness, they are incarcerated by level systems, they're incarcerated by labels. It's no different. That's a cage too for our young people. So I think every single moment, if we really had a focus on the most connected environment, we would see those situations as a crisis, as an emergency. We would not tolerate policies and practices in our system that allow things like placement of children in institutions, 30-day notices. Don't get me started on 7-day notices, 14-day notices, 30-day notices, things that take away every scrap of humanity from a young person. Do you know the message that we send to young people when we allow a caregiver to say 7 days, 14 days, and I want to get rid of them? We're telling them nothing is permanent. Everything is permanent. They are disposable. Their body, their soul doesn't matter. So all of those things, they'd be gone. And instead, we would have a system that really looked at our families as an intervention. And if our families truly are an intervention, you could imagine they're the intervention for everything, right? For mental health, for education, for employment, for transition to adulthood, for every single thing for young people. How would our legal advocacy be different? You'd be in those homes, talking to the caregivers. You'd be prioritizing ensuring that a child is getting parented. Our courtrooms would be different. There wouldn't be third-party representations talking to Judge Martin. You'd have families that are in there. We'd have foster parents and birth parents co-parenting together. They'd be working together to bring children back to the communities. So I just think that really at the end of the day, what would be different is that families would have an entirely different role in our system, and we'd have a system that was truly focused on what young people need. And the way that you would get there would be by letting the families and the young people themselves lead the way.
Well said. I think we should just rename the program now the Most Connected. So, Asan, your thoughts?
So I guess first I should be more clear about my work besides being at HD Solutions. I'm the former Commissioner of Juvenile Justice for the state of Kentucky. I ran that system for 6 years, 1,300 employees operating 36 facilities, 24 hours a day with a $100 million budget. One of the first things that I experienced coming into the system as a leader was this sense that it was the place where dreams go to die. That this was a place where we were in a mentality of hospice, and our job was to give every child a great end-of-life experience because pretty much they were done. And in the work that we do too often, what I've seen is that we have become hospice givers instead of hope dealers. And that's a term that I use very often to really describe the work that has to be done. And so what I challenge my system to do, and it's interesting because the conversation that we had at lunch is very familiar when I decided to cut several facilities in order to reach the budget cuts for the state. And I got calls from the governor and the mayor and the president of the House saying, these are the largest employers in our community. You can't do that. And I had respectfully offered that I was the Commissioner of Juvenile Justice, not the Commissioner of the Department of Labor, so we got different missions. And that really wasn't a convincing argument for them. But the thing that we put forward was the sense that our system ought to be family-centered, youth-focused, trauma responsive, and community-based. That was our best work. If we were able to hit those four as the milestones for how we engage every young person in the system, making sure that if they come through those doors, they don't come through often, they don't stay long, but trying to limit that, because the data all tells us that once they cross that threshold, it automatically creates a cascading downward spiral. And so those pieces really held up the foundation of the work we did to try and get reform in place. And over the last 2 years of my administration, we managed to get some amazing legislation passed that in the 4 years since then has reduced our detention population to less than a quarter of what it had been for so long. But all the facilities are still open because we're the largest employers, and nobody can imagine if we gave, and this was what my deposit was, that why don't we take all that staff that are so good at telling children to sit down, shut up, and do what I tell you to do, and actually train them to be the home intervention specialist, to go in to make sure that the family is well, to make sure the child gets to court, to make sure the school understands their IEP, and we create advocates and champions instead of guards. And so I think that the system, as it is only going to do what it's been trained to do, programmed to do. The only way we change that, and I do think it's not a matter of putting a Band-Aid on a bruise. We got to amputate some stuff. And I think that's the thing that scares so many people in the system across the board, because there are jobs that depend on this. And my biggest aha was visiting one of the facilities in Louisville, one of our biggest detention centers, and I asked the youth worker who was guiding me around, what are our numbers today? And he said, we're down to 50. And he mumbled, and we're not happy about that at all. And I said, excuse me? And he said, oh, we're down to 50, and it's, we're doing really good work. But, he was, for a second there, he was truthful, right? Because we do believe that, not having young people locked in boxes somehow diminishes our ability to do good work and threatens our work. And absolutely it's the opposite. I think we actually need more people in the justice system doing this work, doing it differently, and doing it at a higher level of skill. So I think all those things, my biggest challenge when I've done this, I was vice chair of the Federal Advisory Committee on Juvenile Justice for 3 years, and I chaired Kentucky's Advisory Commission for 10 years. And the biggest challenge that I have seen and experienced over and over again is the sense that, that we've done our best work, right? That we somehow can't innovate and we can't do anything different. I go to judges and say, well, if you're going to send kids to us who haven't committed a crime, I think we're going to go ahead and charge you that $300 a day that we've been holding off for 20 years so that you feel the pain. And so the judge told me I should bring my toothbrush next time I drove through his county because he had a room for me too. But so there's this tension about, there's this right work that we know has to happen, but the entire system is set up to ensure that work doesn't happen because it doesn't feed the coffers. It doesn't feed the complex, right? We're lucky enough to get rid of most of our private institutions. Now the adults are coming back again because we have this incentivized system that's allowing private institutions to trade our children on the stock exchange. And when that is our reality, when it's okay for the bottom line to be, how many beds we keep full, then nobody ever gets better, nobody ever does better, and no community is ever worth sending a child home to. And so we have to really fundamentally examine what our expectations are and what we do. The median, in order to be a youth worker on the front line of my system and countless other systems across this state, this country, was a high school equivalency. And so I went to the governor and said, how about if we at least make it an associate's degree and let me design the program that the community colleges actually teach them so that we know that there's certain skills and certain capacity, and there was an outrage. And so when the value of our children is, and I've got a GED, let me be clear. I've got a GED, I've got a juvenile criminal arrest record, I've got 2 brothers serving life sentences, I've buried 5 cousins to gang-related violence, and I've been in crisis most of my life. And there's some experiences that come from that inform this work directly. I know what happens when people who don't have to choose to create a hopeful environment instead of a hospice environment. And it has to be an intentional act of courage, not something that happens accidentally every once in a while because we were in crisis. And I think that's what we have to do, very intentional about the work we do. And if we're intentional and mindful, I think there are a lot we can do, even in the system we're in now.
That's actually a perfect segue into what we want folks to answer next. You've started talking about the challenges that we need to attack, address, fix, or own. This one won't be a word cloud, but give us a few words from your reaction so far about what you think audience vote, we need to fix? What are the problems or challenges that we need to still attack in order to go from sort of values that are important to us to a real, a system that actually does place kids in the most connected environment? And then while that's coming up, Trainee, please tell us your thoughts on that same question.
So as we shifted our language now to most connected, I think about our system is, I had a new executive come into our county, and he said our county had a lot of bad press, a lot of negative things being said about it. And when he came in he's been a lifelong politician in Georgia, lived in this county for most of his adult life, and he came in and saw the insides working the county government. He said, I know why this is like this, because the county is depressed. The employees are depressed, the buildings are depressed. What is this? How can you possibly provide good service when you're depressed? And that, as you were talking, as Jennifer was talking, I reflected upon the fact that all of those things that she defined and that you defined exist in the system itself. So for me, creating a new system would look like a system that was most connected instead of most siloed, that was least restrictive instead of most restrictive. And most restrictive looks like the inability. We're having a conversation here about innovation, but in nonprofit, where you're accountable to boards, in government, local, state, and federal, where you're accountable to the constituency, when the heck can you be innovative? You're innovative, but we kind of innovative. We can kind of have some conversations in here, but are we going to have those conversations when we leave here? Are we going to say the things that I said I can't really say to a judge? How effective can we be? And when I think about things that have to be fixed in our system, that's number one. We cannot serve when we are not served. We are not in a good, as a system, it's not in a good place. It's not communicative, it's not engaged, it's not connected, it's not supportive, it does not inspire innovation or inspiration. And when during the course of the conversation it is, I was thinking about how would I really describe a least restrictive or a most connected system? For me as a lawyer, or overseeing lawyers who have to go out into the field day to day to fight this fight, you know what it would look like? It would look like, I used to work in television, so I had the opportunity to be innovative. We used to create shows. So it would look like the judge going to the home, and the child's attorney going to the home with the social worker and the teacher or the counselor from the school, and the medical provider who saw the child, the broken baby, all of us being at the house so that we could actually be in that conversation before that child got brought into care or got picked up and detained. That's what innovation would look like. That would be amazing. Where is that going to happen? In my real world. But that's what innovation would look like in a world if I could define it. So if there's something that would need to be repaired in our system, it's the ability to have honest conversation about what's really broken. It's the ability to really call it, and the ability to say somebody's gonna CYA, but not theirs, cover mine, so I can actually do the good work with my people so they can actually do the work with the children and the families that deserve it. Exactly. And that's what needs to be fixed in a system for me, for someone who works with those people who actually are with the families on the day-to-day basis and are despondent and depressed and oppressed and unable to be innovative to actually do the hard work that that needs to be done.
Reactions, Jennifer?
Yeah, this question is kind of a personal question for me because, well, all of it's personal to me, but this question in particular, because I started my advocacy when I was 21. And when I started my advocacy, as soon as I got the microphone and the floor, I really wanted to tell everyone about group homes and juvenile halls and shelters and how bad they were, and all of the things that I experienced and all of the things that other young people experienced. And I was sure that once people heard what was happening, they would fix it, right? And so I spent many, many years with this huge complex, because many of you have known me since I started my advocacy, because I felt like people think I'm literally obsessed with group care, and I could not get people to respond. And so I tried telling the stories in multiple different ways. I tried appealing to people's emotion, to their logic, I had a huge complex, like I'm a really ineffective advocate. And then I became a lawyer, and I got exposed to not just all of the research outcome, but all of the data that exists about the fact that we know definitively that these settings are not just not good for young people's development, but literally cause harm. That every single stage of child and adolescent development is not possible when we place a young person in an institutional setting where they're cared for by shift staff. I mean, we have a whole body of research, and still the field didn't change. And then we talked about numbers, what we're getting, what results are we getting for the ridiculous amount of resources we're spending, and they still didn't change. And so here's where I landed, and what I think is the biggest challenge, and I think you just heard it in our lunchtime session. I think it's fear. And I don't think we can discount how powerful fear can be. And I once heard somebody describe how paralyzing it can be to fixate on plausibility rather than the power of what's possible. And in our field, all we do is fixate on what's plausible, what the statistics tell us is likely, what we've seen time and time before. So when we start talking about a system where we eliminate, we close the beds, we don't just take the young people out, but we make it impossible for folks to put children in there to grow up, that's immediate. People will be on board. Best child advocate in the world will be on board with that idea until you start talking about eliminating that alternative entirely, and then people back up and say, wait a second. What about if young people become homeless? What if they're all in deep-end youth facilities because we can't find a place for them to be? What if we stop removing folks? They become so scared of the change. And almost as if, when I listened to James talk about having a radical imagination, I thought, I almost feel as if our system is entirely unable to imagine a world in which our children, and let's just be honest, it's almost all Black and brown children who are in these most least connected environments, most restrictive environments, where families would love them and nurture them, where communities would want them back in there, where people could see them for who they are entirely. It's almost like we cannot see that as a possibility or an option. What has to happen is we have to push individually and systemically towards love. And there really isn't any other way to do that. But every single policy practice in all of our individual advocacy and in the way that systems operate has to be held up to this sort of measuring stick around how does this ensure that a young person is cared for and loved on a daily basis. And I think that as we're deconstructing, it's just really important to be thinking about, really honestly, about how do our systems continue to benefit from having these kind of least connected, most restrictive environments in place. Because if we're really honest about the answer to that question, we'll realize they serve a purpose. They make things really easy for the adults in the system. You have a 24-hour shelter in your system. It means we can remove young people, drop them off, no questions asked, no effort to, share. If we assess young people in an institutional setting, that means we don't have to support a foster parent in transporting them to the doctor and to the occupational therapist. If we put a young person in group care, we buy some time to do that intensive family finding and look for kin that are there. If we incarcerate a young person, we don't have to worry that, again, we're exposing to risk, right? And so we get so focused on physical safety in the child welfare system, on our goal and sort of the expectation being keeping children alive and free from physical harm. And in the juvenile justice system, we're fixated on public safety, that we ignore that actually the most important element of safety in both systems is whether young people are loved. You don't have community public safety without young people feeling loved. That proverb, if you don't feel the warmth of your village, you're gonna go burn it down, to feel that that's real, right? And for children who do not feel emotionally loved, who do not feel like they are nurtured and in an environment where somebody is parenting them, they are the most unsafe children that you will ever find. So we have to ask ourselves who benefits. And then we have to really look at who are the people that are most impacted, who are closest to the problem, and how can we collectively empower them and build their leadership and build their voice so that they can show us the way. And I think this is young people, it's our families as well, and not just our foster families, but our birth families as well. And it's folks who are on the ground every single day, the caseworkers, the folks who have dedicated their career to working to try to solve the problems. They are the ones who need the collective investment in leadership so that they can be a part of developing the solutions. And then lastly, I think we all have to decide what we can do to create reform that has lasting impact. I'm so sick of it being a 2-year reform and then we're on to the next issue. Let's be very, very clear about what children need, because I'm in lots of different rooms where people talk about lots of different things about what young people need. And at the end of the day, we all know what exactly our children need. And somehow we act like for our children who are in the system, like their hearts are less delicate, like their souls are less tender, like their psyches and their physical bodies, like they're more full of stone than any of the children that we go home to at night, where we know our magic that we deliver to them is when we tuck them into bed at nighttime, when we read them a good night story, when we remember their favorite food and their birthday, when we care about who they are. That's the magic in the juvenile justice system and in the foster care system. And so it's time to think about how do we build a long-term strategy and lasting reform to really move our system around those. So again, thinking about the lunchtime discussion and James talking about doing crazy things. And for those of you who know the Youth Law Center long-term, we spent 3 decades really trying to deconstruct institutional care. So getting children out of adult facilities, closing deep-end youth prisons, trying to close shelters that had babies in them, trying to deal with conditions in group homes and shelters across the country. And then we had leaders and systems turn to us and say, okay, by force or voluntary, we did what you asked us to do, now what? We don't know what to do. We actually don't know how to operate a system that's good. So we've really spent the last decade, and this was really crazy. I mean, I can't tell you how many people have come up to me and said, what on earth is the Youth Law Center doing? What are you doing? What is the Quality Parenting Initiative and how is it legal? So we've spent the last 10 years. 10 years ago, we started in Florida and we went into 3 places and we said, let's bring the people who are most directly impacted to the table. Let's bring the youth to the table, the families to the table, the caseworkers, and let's expose them to what the research says about love and caring and parenting and nurturance, and ask them to envision a different system. And to not work on tinkering with the thing that doesn't work, but what would it look like to actually build the right thing? How would it look like if we aligned our policies and practices on a daily basis in the system around love? So we're 10 years out, 10 states in, 80 jurisdictions across the country, and these places are trying it. They're trying to be crazy, and they're pushing, every single bit of them is pushing against the tide. So through the Quality Parenting Initiative, we're seeing it's possible if you empower the people that are closest to the problem. And when I think about what it takes to do that too, I've been lucky enough this year, I was selected to be a fellow for Just Leadership USA, which is a fellowship program that is for folks who are formerly incarcerated, either as juveniles or adults, to really invest in our leadership capacity to reduce incarceration. And I've never had better leadership training. I mean, it's the kind of leadership training that I wish I had had when I was a young person. But I would love to see every single one of our families, every single one of our young people, every single one of our caseworkers who's on the ground, who's fighting that fight, every single one of the leaders of our system have this kind of training and support to think about how do you take a vision that sounds crazy to everyone. How do we have a system that is based on love, or an approach that's based on love? And how do we move everything? I'd like to see every single one get it.
Have anybody asked you whether love is an evidence-based practice? Yeah, is that like something you have to
If
deal
they
with?
do, I'm gonna slap them. That's
That's right. So Hassan, you had a chance a little bit to get into some of the challenges that we need to fix and own in the first part of your presentation. Do you have any reactions to what the other folks have said so far?
I mean, I think it's all, yeah, that's exactly it. It's, this is the conversation we've been wanting to have. I think that one of the things that we overlook is the power that data really has to move this work.
And data-driven was up on the board
Yeah,
too.
so I mean, I think the idea that we collect all this data, and of course, I get frustrated with DMC. We've been collecting DMC, disproportionate minority contact data, for 20 years, and every time we get to an action plan, well, we probably need to do another data study. And so there's a point that I talk to my folks about living with the best available data. Right? That there's always going to be somebody saying, well, this is incomplete. I don't know if this says everything. But sometimes we have to stake our claim and say, today we act. If the data changes tomorrow, then tomorrow we act again. But the data is that thing that we really have to focus on. I think that the conversations I've had in the last few years has really been pushing the contrast between what we assume about these systems, and we had mentioned about it earlier today, that this is tough on crime and they really are building safer communities, and the data all says that's a lie. But if we can actually operationalize that data, what I did with the legislature was I just gave them the numbers about the number of kids that recidivate and the numbers about the amount of money that we spend, $100,000 a year per child to lock them in a box with no return on investment, with no change in circumstances. And we do this every year without question. We call it the invisible cost of incarceration. And so the conversation quickly went to some kids need to be locked up, which is, where we usually end up going. And so I just put that data up there and we talked about the numbers. And then I found a great slide about the top 5 Ivy League institutions in the nation and what it costs to go there on full scholarship, and I said, we could send every one of these children to Harvard on full scholarship, with a valet, a condo downtown, and a personal chef, and a tutor, and we still don't meet the amount of money that we're spending every year to lock them in the box. So if you call yourself a fiscal conservative, I would just like you to explain to me how that works. And, I think that we don't have to answer that question. They do. The folks that keep making this stand, holding this line, that this is the work that we do. I put it out there, and I put it out in the media, and I made these speeches when they said, well, the governor may not support this. I said, well, in that case, I've got to talk to the people in the media before the governor tells me to shut up. And, but I think what we don't do in this work is we don't operationalize the data we have and create a contrast so powerful that nobody can refute it and debate it anymore, and there have to be action. If they don't act, then it has to be repercussions, right? It's a choice not to act on the data we know works instead of them putting the data off in the corner, which is what we've done very often. So I really think there's a real powerful piece to this that we already have control over, that we don't operationalize and we don't use in a way that really pushes forward our own agenda.
Think about the data that we have, like you said, recidivism rates from these facilities we send kids to, right? I mean, if you want to know what's not going to work, I mean, we know, right?
And actually, I want to retract my previous statement about slapping someone, and
all right.
and say that actually, whoever wrote that love is an evidence-based practice, it is.
Yeah.
It's in fact really the only evidence-based practice that we have definitively. If you go to the evidence-based clearinghouse in child welfare and you look at what their highest rated intervention is, it's something called attachment biobehavioral catch-up, which sounds fancy, but what it is it's training caregivers of young people in foster care to love the baby relentlessly. That's what it is. It literally changes regulatory systems and cortisol systems. Cortisol system is a hormone in your body that helps you regulate stress. It's set for life when you're a little one. So it literally gives these children a different biological system to help them weather the world. In the juvenile justice system, all of the evidence-based interventions that we have for the most difficult populations, and I'm going to put difficult in quotes, but the ones that we frequently say they can't be in families, they can't be in the communities because they've been commercially sexually exploited, because they're a sex offender, because they have such difficult behavior. In fact, it's families for every single one of them. It's families that make the difference. So it is an evidence-based intervention, and we do know that it works. And so I totally agree with what you're saying, is that it's not just morally the right thing to do, and love sounds so like squishy and easy for people to dismiss it, right? But it is actually the most powerful thing that we have in our system. And again, somehow we act like it's not possible for our young people.
Okay, so we're going to transition to the last part, the last question that we want you guys to react to. And before we do, we want the audience to give us yet another sort of set of responses related to a prompt. We want to know, how does our advocacy need to change if we're going to change the system? Because I think one of the things we have to accept or own is that part of the problem with our kids ending up in these placements is that as a failure of advocacy. What do we need to do differently if we're gonna make things different? And so I'm gonna come back to Trainee to start us off on that while we look at some responses coming up.
I think I have to only reiterate what has been said as to the point about love and the point about fear or lack thereof, and about, I really liked what you said about saying it to the media before they could tell you not to say it. But what has to change in our advocacy to me is the very first thing I said was I have a daughter, and to treat every child like I would want my child to be treated. And that if that doesn't become the standard, whatever child you love in your life, the one you love that's not involved with work, that doesn't bring up feelings of stress and emotion because of your job, that's the baseline standard. For me, advocacy, in order for it to be effective, I guess I've been doing a lot of, my consideration is about people who do the groundwork. That's where I think from at all times, because I know the barrier that creates for them, this situation they're in of having to be the ones who are interfacing directly with these families and policies that aren't actually things that they're required to do, but don't actually work on the ground. And so the opportunity to be in an environment that is creative and innovative, the ability to speak up and say that this just doesn't in our system work, let's try something different. I am a strong proponent of those leaders. I sit in a lot of rooms with a lot of leaders, and we have a lot of conversations up here. And then when we go here, those conversations and these actions don't really have anything to do with each other. And it's the people in rooms like this, and every one of you sit in other rooms, because otherwise you wouldn't be in this room. You sit in other rooms with leaders that have the opportunity to speak plainly and fearlessly. But honestly, how often don't we do that? How often don't we really say what needs to be said? And don't we really provide that practical baseline suggestion, advice, consideration that's really going to serve a child? How often do we just kind of gloss over what we know doesn't work so that we can get to the bigger issue or the bigger point or the save my budget or the make sure my legislation passes, because there's always a give and a get. I think to be effective in advocacy, and maybe not at the ground level and at a bigger, broader systems level, I'm very interested now in how the millennials are affecting our system. I keep having these conversations, these start-stop conversations, because they are the ones who actually do the work now. And there's more of us, whatever we are, versus the millennials, like are in this room now. But the reality is they're taking over and they're coming strong and quick and they're changing the workforce. And then the Gen Zers, which are the teens and the children now that we purport to serve, they are the ones to whom we must turn the reins over to and must take into consideration and serve and support in a way that the world works for them, and it's different for us. And so if you look at the entities, the businesses, the industries that are for-profit industries, they are quickly recognizing that they can't operate the way that they used to operate if they want to meet their bottom lines, which is dollar signs, and they will meet them or they won't exist. Their shareholders will make sure of that. But we don't look at our industry that way. We never have. And this is a business, whether it's a business with the juvenile justice systems or if it's the largest employer in a community, it is a business. And if we don't become more flexible, leaner and meaner, more amenable to what our community and our society is looking like and is going to look like, we will continue to fail. And failure looks worse and worse every time. And our children are leaving this system in a way that they are not even remotely able, where they couldn't compete 10 years ago, what are they gonna do if they're raised in foster care and are detained in a juvenile justice system or in a restricted environment or not loved, and they can't compete in a world that is speeding past them. So I think that what has to change about our advocacy is some real transparent honesty about what we are dealing with and how we are failing and how we're really gonna change. Otherwise, we can just accept it and stop having all of these conversations. That's the best I can offer.
Your reaction, Jenna?
So I think I've said a number of the things that I think need to change related to advocacy, but let me just repeat a couple of them. One is, I think we have to align our advocacy around love and parenting at every turn. And so every single decision that is made in a case, and I'm not just talking about foster care, I'm talking about the juvenile justice system as well, because this makes me crazy. It's the same young people. I was in and out of group homes, juvenile hall, shelters. I can tell you we were the same young people. And so if it's not good for a young person who's in foster care, it's not good for a young person who's in the juvenile justice system. We need to be very clear about what do children need, period, and what's harmful to children, and take that approach. So this business of like vacating the group homes that youth in foster care are in so we can fill them with youth from the juvenile justice system who were taken, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't allow it to happen in your jurisdiction. So I think that's one thing we have to do is every single decision that gets made the question is asked, how does this support or get in the way of a young person being loved and connected? And we prioritize that in our advocacy. But I also think that this requires, it's not just, unfortunately, policy changes and practice changes. I think it's an entirely different culture. And culture is one of the hardest things to change, but we also know how to do it. And so if you go in the for-profit sector, lots of folks have worked on changing culture. I think you're hearing from somebody who's changed the culture, their agency. We know how to do it, we know how not to do it, and it's really a values-based approach. And one of the most important things about changing culture, I think, is that you have to invest in the leadership of the people that are closest to the problem. So again, those young people, those families need to be in rooms like this when we're having discussions about what needs to happen and what do children's rights look like over, the next decade. Then their leadership, they need to guide the way for us. Because, and I said this yesterday too, but I'll say it again. If I'm gonna work with anybody, I prefer to work with teenagers. And in a lot of ways, I am jealous all the time when I work with youth because youth do not care. They will tell you what's right. They will tell you what's just. They're not going to settle for something that's not right or they don't care if there are not currently resources or if it sounds ridiculous and it can't be operationalized and if no policymaker is ever going to buy that XYZ. They don't care. It's the right thing to do, so adults get it done. And so I regularly try to spend most of my time around young people if I have the chance because they keep the fire under me to not care about any of those very adult concerns that, again, it's the fear that you all heard about in the lunchtime session that gets in the way of having a radical imagination about what can happen and what can be and what our young people actually deserve.
I think that's exactly where I was going in the whole thing of mitigating possibility. And I think in advocacy, what we do very often is we try to negotiate a means instead of standing by what we know is the absolute expectation, the best practice, the only thing that's acceptable. And it speaks directly to the conversation that we have with young people who know what they need and know what they want. And so if we as advocates and champions, as hope dealers, have the ability to say, this is the line, and I'm not negotiating down for my client. I'm not negotiating down. And the truth is, the system is going to react to that. And it's going to try to purge us. And it does, we talk about the fact that I called the media and got into it. So let's be clear. I'm not Commissioner of Juvenile Justice now, right? And so I made a decision that the work that I was doing was so important that I would be willing to do anything to make sure that the right information got out. And that there's a cost to that. And I think too often we're in a risk-adverse environment, and we have settled ourselves with doing good enough. And there's a point where good enough will get you, right? If it's versus bad or good enough, that's cool. But if it's great or good enough, then we got things to talk about. And so I think that as advocates, we need to be fearless, intentional, and dogged about what we know works, what we know is our truth, and we need to stop backing down from it. Because that is what we've been doing for the last 20 years, and we've not gotten the reauthorizations we deserve, we've not got the changes we deserve. We still have judges who take children who have committed no crime and lock them up for 3 or 4 years because we said, okay, well, there's a group home we can put them in so we can mitigate that. So I think we have to finally draw a line and refuse. This is our point of no return. We don't go back, we don't back down, and we are right. The data tells us we're right, so we have to hold that and push it until everybody else recognizes that we really are.
Can I add one other thing? In my work, I was introduced to this idea of a root cause analysis. And the way that it was implemented in the system that I was observing was that the leader at the top of a system brought in the front line in the streets, midnight taking a child out of the home or doing the work on the roads or whatever, brought them to the table about a issue that was imploding in the system. And nobody could figure out why. The money was there, the laws were there, the policies were there, everything was in place, but they could not get over this obstacle. And nobody can answer the question why. And everybody, mid-level leaders, the lower level executives, everybody's like, we're doing what we're supposed to do, it's all good. What's the problem? That systems leader sat down at a table with those frontline people and they answered questions at a very technical level that would have never been answered with all the brain power that had sat at the tables for years. And they answered questions. And when I tell you that the systems leaders were sweating bullets because they know they're doing right, but they can't figure it out and they don't know what's going to be said. Until we do that, and that those frontline being those children and youth, those families, and those frontline workers, that is a three-prong, and that's real. Until those people come to the table, to the conversations with all the things that we have in place that we can do right and the resources and this, that, and the other, until they are in this conversation, we'll be doing this forever. And it's a scary thing to do. It is terrifying, but I believe wholeheartedly it is truly the answer because the children and families hold you accountable for the line. But it's that person who's on the front line that says, I know your rule is good, but it doesn't really work. It doesn't actually work. It sounds great. Paper looks good. It reads well, but it doesn't work because of that thing that only they can see at that level of interfacing with those we purport to serve. I encourage you all, I had to say that before I left the table, to do that. Do something small that you feel safe in your environment to do and see the amazing results that it gets. Thank you.
So Asan, are you willing to do one more piece for us?
Sure. Remember that song by Bill Withers, Lean on Me? You know how it goes? Sometimes in our lives, help me out. We all have pain. Hands up, you know the song. We all have sorrow. But if we know why, we know that there's always tomorrow. Anyway, see, that was the song on the radio the day I got the news. I was at home by myself, I had the radio turned up kind of loud, and I guess I was trying to sing when the phone rang. Hello, I said. Nobody answered. Hello, I said a bit louder. The voice started screaming, he's dead, he's dead. They killed Bebe. And the whole world started spinning, me trying to sit before I fall, this voice echoing through my soul. They killed Bebe. And Bill's on the radio singing, call me when you need a friend. See, Bebe was my cousin, Cedric, about the same age as my youngest brother, Tony. He was dead. He was the first of my generation to go out like that. He wasn't the last. He wasn't the youngest. He just got to be the first. Baby was a father at 16, used to run the streets. We all used to run the streets. You know how to laugh at itself. And you got to know how to laugh at yourself, you know, to survive those St. Louis streets. So I go home for the funeral. And the boy who killed my cousin is already out of jail. And that's when me and mine start talking like it's time to go play. You know, it's time to go play judge, and it's time to go play jury, and it is time to go play executioner, and that's when it hits me. This is what it's all about. Let your emotion strength to that insanity, hold on so tight and so long to the madness like cancer, it eats you from the inside and build and build and plan. You can't help but go off like a gun. Somewhere another baby sits staring at the door that she don't know will never open again. And somewhere another mama sits cradling a phone that she knows will never ring again. And somewhere another family, another community is changed forever again. And that is not how I want to make it to the other side. So I start trying real hard not to let other people push my buttons and make me do things. But sometimes I still get so damn mad, I can't see straight. Then that song will pop into the back of my head. And sometimes I pick up my phone, I push the little stop button, I say, hello, you know, I'm talking to the other side. I say, I miss you, baby. I say, I miss you, Steve-O. God, I miss JoJo. See, Joe was only 14 when they shot him in the head. And I say, I miss you, and I will never forget you, and thanks for listening. And I wish I could return the favor. But I'll talk to you again real soon, so just keep watching my back. Peace. Now, the whole time, it's that song, you see. It never stops playing in the back of my head. I ride up the road, and I'll share your load. If you just call me, call me. Yeah, I remember that song. Now that's Bebe's song. Thank you.
So I just want to say thanks to all three of you for sharing your thoughts today, for preparing for this, and for a great conversation, and two amazing poems.